Teaching geometry in English, teaching fractions in English, teaching the psychological aspects of a preschool child in English. Now, how many of you university professors have wanted to teach your courses in English but have found this challenging? I'm Branka Milenović, and I am an English professor with a specialization in English language teaching and composition and rhetorics, which means in the writing skill. Today, I will be talking to you about teaching your courses in English, hopefully helping you to teach your courses in English. And I will be also referring to some communicative aspects of teaching a lecture in general. So, we can say that every lesson is different in terms of its content that we teach, but every lesson is the same in its communicative purpose. If we want to communicate an idea, we want to pay attention to our audience. So at the very beginning of your lecture, I recommend that you make a promise to your students, that you make a promise of what you're going to teach and then fulfill that promise throughout the lecture. So today, I will be making a promise to you in terms of the general aspects that I will cover in this lecture. So this lesson will include two major parts. It will include the communicative aspects of planning a lecture, and it will also include the useful language elements that you will need when you want to teach your course in English. Now, since this audience today is ESP audience, English for Specific Purposes audience, since it is comprised of university professors who teach different departments and faculties, I will try to make my language accommodate the level of teaching that you will need, the level of language that you will need for teaching your own courses. Now, today's lesson will include several aspects, and my recommendation to you when you make a promise is to use the blackboard, to write out lesson points that you will cover during your lesson, and while you cover, when you're at different stages of the lesson, tick off or cross out the lesson points that you have finished with. So, today's lesson will include a lesson outline. It will also include useful expressions, linguistic elements throughout the lesson. And when I say useful expressions throughout the lesson, I refer to the beginning of the lesson, the middle part of the lesson, the ending of your lesson. In addition to these linguistic elements, I will also talk to you about the use of visual aids when teaching a lecture. And finally, at the end, I will refer to the very important aspect of interaction that we need to establish with our audience, and also interaction that we need to motivate within the audience, so amongst the students themselves. Therefore, our lecture today will begin with the lesson outline. And here I have illustrated in the slide all of these elements that I have written on the board. But it is useful to use the board because on the board you will be able to cross out and tick off as you proceed through the different stages of the lesson. Now, at the beginning of your lecture, your students must know the following: how the lecture will begin, how the lecture will proceed, so the different stages, what they will learn throughout the lecture, and how the lecture will end. Now, this gives the students a better understanding of the lecture, better control of what they are to expect, but in return, it also presents you as a professor as someone who is in control of your entire lecture, entire lesson, so from the very beginning to the very end of the lecture. When the students are aware of the purpose of the lecture, they have a better understanding of it. So this lecture must have the so-called WIFT, an acronym used by Deborah Grayson Regal, a professional speaker and speaking instructor. What does WIFT mean? Well, what's in it for them? So the lecture, the lesson outline must tell the students what they will have, what they will get out of this lecture today. Basically, what sort of information they will carry on home from today's class. At the very beginning, when you begin to speak, whether it's a lecture that we're talking about or just a general presentation, it is always useful to attract the attention of your audience. If you attract the attention of your audience at the very beginning, well, you will, from the very start, have active listeners. So they will be following your lecture from the very beginning and on throughout the stages. How do we attract attention? Well, we attract the attention of the audience through using attention grabbers. These attention grabbers might be startling information, quote, rhetorical question, or an anecdote, which are the most common attention grabbers that we have at our disposal. Now, on this slide, I have presented to you some examples of these attention grabbers that I have just mentioned. So, startling information would be some alerting, shocking piece of information. It is usually some sort of a statistic. You may also use a quote that attracts attention, that is relevant to the topic. You may use a rhetorical question, as I have used at the beginning of this lecture, when I said how many of you university professors have wanted to teach your course in English but have found it challenging. When you use the rhetorical question, you use it not with the aim to get the answer. You use it to raise an issue, so that we all think about that question at this point. An anecdote is a way to personalize your beginning and to reduce the gap between you as a professor and your students as the audience. So when you use an anecdote, when you tell a story, you will that way bring them closer together, make your lecture more believable. So at this point, we can refer to our board and tick off that we have talked about the lesson outline. We proceed now with the useful expressions that we may use, that you may use in your courses when you teach your course in English throughout the different stages of a lecture. So when we take a look at the beginning of the lecture, these are some of the useful linguistic elements, sentence construction elements that you may consider when preparing a lecture in English. So you can say, I will begin today's lesson by explaining the topic. This afternoon, I am going to discuss the topic. I will be talking about the dangers of internet use. And finally, the most complex construction here, this morning I would like to demonstrate to you the specific uses of internet. If you want to review, sometimes at the beginning of our lecture, we want to review something from the previous lecture, from the last class. So here we would be using the simple present tense, and we would use prompts as such. Last class we discussed, talked about, analyzed, etc. Let us review what we learned during the last class. Or you may choose to engage your students at this point, because we said interaction is important. Not only interaction at the end of the lecture, but interaction throughout the different stages of lecture. So you may pose a question to your students. What did we say about the topic last class? Or what did we learn last class? Moving on with the lesson, you may continue within that beginning part of the lecture. You may continue with the use of imperatives and simple present tense to start off with working with your students on specific examples, specific maybe equations, graphs, tables, and so on. So you can ask them to open their books to a specific page, turn to page 16, to open their notebooks and write something down, or to take notes, to write down the following, to copy maybe a table, chart, diagram, either from the slides, from the book, from the board. Now, useful expressions during the lecture is our next topic, so we may say that we can tick off the beginning part of the lecture. Useful expressions during the lecture. Now, this is the central part of your lecture. This is when you provide examples, give explanations, teach different stages, categories of the material, and so on. So you will be, once again, you will refer to the use of imperatives and simple present tense, and you may provide your students with the following prompts, or begin your different stages of this middle part with the following prompts. Look at the examples, graphs, pictures, on page, in the unit, etc. Fill out the table from the board, from the graph, or from the page. Discuss the results about. Discuss the examples, the percentages on a specific page. You may ask them, how do you explain the results, examples, percentages, etc.? What can you conclude about the provided results, numerical data? Now, other common words that might be useful during this middle central part of your lecture may be various verbs that I have used today during this lecture, but also various verbs that I have not used, but that are useful, that can be useful to you further on. These verbs would be give, show, talk, illustrate, emphasize, report, focus, divide, start out, etc. You have noticed that there is a very important part of your lecture would be devoted to prepositions. So we must, as professors, pay special attention to prepositions when we want to say that something is on a specific page, in a specific unit, on the board, at the front of the classroom, etc. Now, we come to the signals in the speech that help the students to know where the lecture is presently at what stage the lecture is at, And this is very useful because once again, as we said at the beginning, you let the students have control over the lecture that is taking place. You let them have control over the stages, how much has been covered, how much more will be covered. So these signals in speech are, in this part of the lecture, I would like to define. Before I move on to my next point, I would like to emphasize. This brings me to the issue of. This leads us to the following, to the next category. As I mentioned, as I said before, earlier, let us go back to. So we may tick off one more point that we have covered today, and this is the middle part of the lecture. We come to the ending part of the lecture. Now, at the very end, when concluding, we basically have two functions of the end of the lecture. First function is to summarize everything that has been said, to draw a sort of a conclusion from it. And the second part is to assign some homework, assignment task, a reading task, a research task to be done at home. So, when summarizing the lecture, you will see that there are models that can be used. Based on the topic, we can conclude. We may come to the conclusion that, what can you conclude from, posing a question to them. And when we provide students with assignments to do for homework, here it is frequent, the use of imperatives and simple present tense is frequent. So for next class, please do task example 13. For next class, fill out, explain, draw, illustrate, define. For homework, read, only read, or read and analyze, define, discuss. Your homework for next class will be to fill out or to read, to explain. Here we have the use of the future simple tense. I recommend the following literature as a reading assignment for next class. Okay, so we have covered our useful expressions for all three stages of the lecture, and we come to the final 2 points that we will be talking about today, and this is the use of visual aids, and then afterwards the interaction. Now, the use of visual aids is a very important topic that we need to discuss today, especially in this contemporary world of the 21st century. And not only because of that, but because of the fact, and many researchers have proven, because of the fact that our students are mostly visual learners. From 80 to 85% of your students are visual learners. So you need to provide them with a visual input. Now, visual aids are important, but they can be interesting and motivating if used adequately. They can be boring and they can be confusing if not used adequately. They're useful teaching tool because they help students to understand the material better. So it's not only the audio input that they're receiving, they're also receiving the visual input. And besides understanding, they help the students' retention of the material. So they will help them remember parts of the lecture that have been covered with visual aids. Different parts of visual aids that we might use, well, these can be posters, flip charts, the board. They can be overhead projectors with overhead transparencies. They can be objects, or they can be PowerPoint presentations as we're using today. Now, I have here chosen several most common visual aids that we use in class, and I will just briefly talk to you about the use of posters, handouts, and PowerPoint presentations. When I say the use of posters, well, I can say here that these pieces of advice may apply to flip charts as well. So, when you make posters that are well organized, okay? Make posters and flip charts that have the information ordered logically on them. So if your topic is central, make the information branch off from the topic, okay? So going from the inside towards the outside, or possibly pieces of information pointing towards the central topic. You may also logically organize your information going from left to right, right to left, top to bottom, or bottom to top. Now, use information moderately on these posters and flip charts. Don't overuse, don't put too much text, too many charts, too many diagrams. Don't make the poster or the flip chart confusing, because it will then not be useful for your lecture. When we talk about handouts, well, the handouts that you provide can have more or less information on them. If they have more information on them, my suggestion to you would be to give these handouts out at the end of the class as some sort of reading assignments and discuss them next class. However, if your assignments have less information on them and you want to use them during the class, there is also a specific way on how to use these handouts during your lecture. Always tell your students when to take a look at the handout, okay? If you tell them at what point to look at the handout, they will be listening to you. If you do not tell them, their attention may be drawn away from your speech to the handouts. So explicitly tell your students when to look at the handouts. Now we come to the PowerPoint presentations, and the most important aspect when PowerPoint presentations are concerned is the fact that we should remember that these PowerPoint presentations are used only for brief outlining, okay? And not only for brief outlining of what you're about to say, but also for presenting visuals such as graphs, tables, charts, something that is difficult to present on the board or possibly on the flip chart. Never write on your slides all that you want to say. If you put too much information on your slides, first of all, the font will be small. Secondly, the audience, the students, will be devoted to reading from the slides instead of establishing interaction with you, eye contact with you, okay? And definitely, reading from the slides is not interesting and not engaging for your students. We have said not to use too small of a font so that the audience cannot see, but also do not use too many different styles of font. Do not overuse capital letters, bold, italics. Do not overuse color in your slides. If you overuse any of these aspects, the attention of your students will be drawn away from the topic. So we have finished with presenting tips on how to use visual aids, and we will tick it off and come to the last point that we will cover today, which is the interaction with and interaction in the audience. Interaction is important. Your lectures must be interactive engaging, motivating, so that your students will be passive and not, so that your students will be active and not passive listeners. From my point of view, a good lecture is one that is conversational, that involves the audience. So during the lecture, ask your students what they think about the topic, how they understand the specific parts of the topic, and these are some of the prompts that you might use. So, what do you think, obviously, about the results, the examples? How do you explain, see, understand? What can you conclude from? What do you think happened? Why do you think this happened? What do you think will happen if? What are the causes, effects of something? So these are all useful ways of interacting with your audience, establishing contact, direct contact between the professor and the students. Now, interacting with the audience is just as important as allowing interaction within the audience, okay? So motivate your students to have pair group discussions, to discuss the topic, to explain to each other something that they might not understand, to define something to one another. These are the prompts that you might use at this stage. In pairs, groups talk about, discuss, and find a solution to, okay? Motivate them additionally. Explain to each other. Ask each other about the topic and then write down the answers. Use the graph, chart, table to discuss in groups the results. So we have covered finally the final point in our lesson today, and we come to the ending part of the closure of the ending part of the lecture. So at the very end, I must say that closure is just as important as the beginning of your lecture. So you as professors and presenters should pay special care not only to the attention grabbers, to how you will begin your lecture, but also to the ending of your lecture. And in the closure part, basically we have two elements. We have summarizing the content of today's lesson, for instance. So summarizing the content of your lecture, and in that way fulfilling the promise that you have given, checking whether you have fulfilled the promise that you have given at the beginning. And finally, you need an effective ending to close this entire deal, this lecture. So we might say a very important statement at this point that we should always keep in mind, and that is that students remember the most what is said the last. So we don't want to thank our students at the end. We don't want them to remember how we were thanking them. Okay? Not only that, thanking your audience, in this case students, makes your presentation, your lecture less valuable. So we want, as teachers and as presenters, we want to suppose that the audience is there because they have a need for the information that we're giving. So do not thank your audience at the end. Give them something impressive, something that they will remember, possibly discuss and talk about after the lecture is over. But before we get to the effective ending, as far as the summary is concerned, these are some of the prompts that you might use to summarize your lecture. To summarize, conclude, we may say, today we have learned the lesson outline, how to prepare a lesson outline, what the importance of the lesson outline is. We have learned what the useful language for different stages of the lecture are. We have learned some tips in terms of using the visual aids, and we have also emphasized some tips on how to interact with students and how to motivate interaction among students. And there you go. I have briefly covered, summarized, what the promise actually that I have given at the very beginning of the lecture, I have fulfilled throughout the lecture and summarized this promise, brought it to a closure at this point. Note that there is a frequent use of present perfect tense, the resultative aspect of it at this point. Finally, we can have an effective ending of our lecture. How? Well, by maybe telling a joke, by giving some sort of a quotation, like the one illustrated here from the Hippocratic Oath. We can have a strong statement at the end of the lecture, like the ones illustrated here. That is why evolution is always revolution. Therefore, we return to the primary operations where multiplication and division are completed before addition and subtraction. It is always useful to end on a positive note, to end with a lasting impression, to provide your students with something that they will think about, remember, talk about afterwards. So now we will end this lecture that I have prepared for you today by saying that the communicative aspect of a lecture is always just as important as the content aspect. So we, as professors, when we teach in English, we must consider what we teach in terms of language, but even more, we must consider how we teach it.